which is took me a minute. So I'm yeah. Thanks, Jim. See you in a moment.
Hello, George.
Hello. Had a little trouble restarting. Zoom wouldn't start for me, so I had to restart my computer and, of course, shut down all the stuff that I had carefully set up here.
Of course.
And I've sent John Hunter an email, but I've not heard back from him.
Okay. I'd love to hear John's opinions on this topic, although I have a suspicion I have a good idea what they are.
Yeah, I think call John Hunter.
Calling John Hunter. Mobile.
Why
Hello,
not?
Jim. George said he would try and rope you into this discussion.
John? Hello, John. Hey, you going to join us online tonight? It's in the Learning Center, but if you want, I will copy you the information. Hold on. I will make it simple for you. In fact, I will email you the information. I'll put the phone down for a moment.
Hey, can anybody hear me, Jim?
I can hear you, Jim.
Okay, good. Just checking. I've been watching the other Flying Club presentation
Oh,
on another Zoom channel, where Jay Neighbors and
sure.
Jeff Stallings are presenting on what tech rides are all like. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to turn that one off and divert over here.
Well, I'm sure there are a lot of people who are interested in that,
Yeah.
which is fine.
Well, what I've seen so far, I would never want to take another check ride right now because it looks pretty incredibly difficult.
Yeah. Everybody has their own idea of what a check ride should be, most notably examiners.
Well, Jay was using all these acronyms. I've heard of, pride and I'm safe and all that. So he had, for spin recovery, he had pray and pair, and I have to look those ones up. I'm afraid I don't remember what those are.
He loves that stuff. The FAA loves that stuff. Most of them just boil down to don't be stupid.
Yeah, but that's a challenge for some people, George.
I understand. Some people need more detail than that.
That's true.
Barry Schiff did a column a few years back where he took one of those favorite FAA acronyms,
Yeah.
and just followed the tree, and it goes out in many, many branches, and they all eventually circle back to the same one.
That's funny.
And some of them, from time immemorial, everybody says gumps before they land. Some
Sure.
of those things have merit, but I don't know. I guess I take a more analog view of things. So, hello, Mr. Hook.
Oh, and we have two Jims now.
How about that? I'll turn one of them off.
We'll pick the better looking one.
Yeah, my computer is difficult.
And I'm having problems with the microphone as well, but I think I've got it working now.
Yeah, we got you now.
We've got you now.
All right.
John, since we're a small group for the moment, tell me a little bit about your flying experience and how you came to the club.
Well, I started off at 0 hours with the club. and it's something that I've always wanted to do since I was a little kid. And
That's a familiar story.
yeah, and just kind of life gets in the way. I made a few wayward trips to some airports over the years, and in high school I volunteered for a flight line safety group in Elkhart, Indiana. They had a big flight show that they would do, and I would volunteer out there. And it was interesting having Gene be my instructor, in that we're kind of both from that area.
Yeah.
And it's been a few years. I think I'm just a little over 135 hours now. I flew mostly the 152s, and Dwight taught me how to fly the 172. I think about July of last year, and
Yeah, we had a very good time together.
yeah, absolutely. And just looking to continue that, and maybe switch over to the Warrior, and maybe next year work towards my instrument rating. And I've been busy with work, a lot of travel. Obviously, the travel stopped now, and so it's been kind of nice to have these calls just to kind of remain in touch with everyone. And I saw this topic, and I was like, that'd be interesting to listen to. I've never done a spin. Gene offered to do one time, and we just never got to it. And I think most of the way I was taught is really just to avoid it altogether. Understand what it is, know how it's going to happen, and just avoid it.
That's kind of the ultimate goal. Gene, how'd you get along with Gene?
I got along with him really well, but it's interesting. I think even you asked me one time. I think it was at the pre-solo check, and how do you get along with Gene? Gene's just the nicest person, but he can get a little aggressive in the cockpit sometimes, and you just kind of got to take that with a grain of salt. But I think at the same time I realized I was learning from someone that probably has forgotten more about flying than I'll ever know, and you got to approach it that way. And I did learn a lot from him.
I probably told you at that time that Gene students always make the best landings because he won't tolerate anything else.
He will not. Yeah, he was always on me about that. The rudder, just anything.
We used to have occasionally spot landing contests.
Yeah.
And we quit because Gene just retired the trophy. Everybody else was playing for second place. We were going to have a special category for him, like handicaps in golf or something.
Right.
He's just a great stick and rudder pilot and taught those skills better than anybody. And he could be, he just was demanding in the airplane. He's such an easygoing guy on the ground, but he could be very demanding in the airplane. But his students made the best landings always.
Yeah, he had very high expectations, but I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, that's great. John?
Yeah, hello.
Hello, John.
Hey, John.
Sorry to be a little late.
Oh, it's okay. So far, it's kind of just us.
Uh-huh.
I think other people may be over in Jay's presentation about check rides.
Actually, I got a Slack message from Hines, and he is still over there, but is going to be joining us in a few minutes.
Well, we can wait a few minutes.
Sure.
I expect some other people probably will be too. I think some of my students may be over there. I should have changed the scheduling a little bit, but we've been so busy I didn't notice it, and I didn't want to ask Jay to change his time. And so,
Well, can I, may I butt in? I have to say, I appreciate finding the Wings of Carolina YouTube channel. And I was really impressed with George, you and John going over the history of the club there. It looked like you posted that just last week or so, but it certainly, and I couldn't sit through all of it, but in little spots here and there, it really made me reminisce about the 1970s. It caused me to pull out my logbook, which I can see now the value of the logbook really is to remember things, like 50 years ago. Oh yeah, I remember doing this. And by the way, John, I see I have a lot of entries with us doing instrument training back in 77 or something like that. So I got a kick out of that YouTube channel. So I do appreciate y'all taking the time and trouble to do that.
well, I think we should do that again, because since then I've found some more photographs And John has boxes of stuff, and there should be a record of that. But the logbook thing, I had somebody show up at the club back in the 90s, I guess, and had been away from flying and wanted to start flying again. And I asked her if she still had her logbook, and she did. And she brought it, she opened it up, and it was a scrapbook. She had the required stuff in there, but she said, look, I'm never going to be a professional pilot. So she had, snapshots of every flight she'd taken and pictures of her kids and all in this. And I thought, that's great. It was a legal logbook. She had the required things logged in there, but she just treated it like a scrapbook. And I thought that was pretty great. Somebody should I bet somebody does, do an electronic logbook of the sort that a lot of people use these days, but have it so that you could link to it all kinds of photographs and things like that.
Yeah.
I think that would be a sensation. And then, you could just, you hit one button and all that stuff goes away and you have a very professional looking logbook. But then you hit the other button and up pop all these, you mouse over every flight you took and pictures of it pop up and, all the violations you committed, all the emergencies you declared. It would be great.
The logbook in ForeFlight allows you to attach pictures to it.
Oh, fantastic. I was about to say, Dwight, get to work on that.
Yeah, right. No, I think Ken's right. We actually have that ability, at least again with the ForeFlight logging.
Okay.
I've always thought it was a great idea, but it's not something that I've actually done myself. And I think I'm going to regret that, as the years go by. I even looked, I drug out my old, original pilot's logbook because very early on I went to do spin training. It's something I was always fascinated by. And I wanted to figure out how early on. So I had to pull out the logbook to find out.
So
I sure as hell couldn't remember.
How early was it in your career?
I was right at about just shy of 80 hours.
That's impressive.
I was just fascinated, but I don't want to get into that too soon. George and I were on the phone earlier today talking about plans for tonight and some things that we wanted to talk about. And I kept having to forcefully keep myself from starting to launch into the conversation.
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Well, I think it's fair game to find out when people starting into it. My quick story is that in my very first dual lesson.
Well, John, you're going to have to tell a story. Well, what the heck?
It's very quick. It's very quick, but it might be useful later. In my very first lesson, the first time I'd flown, this was in 1960. I was 14 years old, and went up in an Aranca, and then the instructor was an ex-Air Force guy, very gruff, and he had the whole notion that this flight instruction was about washing people out. That's what it was about. And
we should do more of that.
And so, he'd yell at me and all kinds of things. I won't go into that, but, hit me in the back of the head and this kind of stuff. But in the first lesson, he says, okay, son, you should know that you have to fly this way and that. I'm going to show you something here. I said, whatever, okay. This is the first time for me, sitting in an airplane that way. So he racks it into a spin, and I just about lost it. And he says, that's what can happen if you screw up. And he climbs up. He says, I want to show you doing it the other direction. I'm thinking, oh, God, please no. And I said, I think I need to land. I'm getting sick. And he said, you won't make a good pilot. So we landed.
Yeah, well, to this day, you're not a big fan of spins, I know.
That's true.
So you can blame it on this guy.
Yeah.
Hey, John, I have a question for you, though. Do you remember what model Aranca it was?
Huh.
I should know. Heel brakes, that I know because they were fun.
Okay, cool.
But I'm going to say it's a 1946 vintage, somewhere in there.
Okay. Yeah, cool. Very cool.
And noisy as hell.
Well, if I may jump in, I understand, and John, I think I recall a lot of your opinions about spins in past discussions.
But part of what I do in
I'd
the
be
glider,
curious to know what they are. Go ahead.
oh, you want me to remind you? Well, that's what the history is for. So part of what I do in the glider club is we sell commercial rides.
Yep.
And some people have never been in a small aircraft before. And it's really incumbent upon the pilot, whether it's me or any of the other guys that give commercial rides, to assess, what they're looking for. Because some people really do want to come out and have a very gentle experience, and they've heard gliders are all quiet and smooth and all this. And so it helps us to try to give them what they're looking for. And some kids come out and they seem to want to do maneuvers, and the worst we do is a dive and a climb and a kind of a half of a lazy 8 or something. But really, you kind of have to listen to the audience and interview them, actually, like do a little bit of a dive and ask them how that was. So I really think it depends on the passenger or the student how far they want to go. I'll be quiet.
Well, and I love giving people rides, even long before I was instructing. And one of my big goals was to always do exactly what you're talking about, figure out what they were up for, encourage them to take the controls, but I wanted everyone to come away wanting to do more. That was kind of my ultimate goal. If they wanted to do something, I had friends of my son who wanted to do something a little exciting. And I would do a lot of what you're talking about, a dive and then a pull up and a push over the top. They thought that was thrilling. There's some people who had never been in a little airplane before, and they were frankly scared. I had one woman, coworker, fly with me once. This was in the RV. And I said, you can take the controls if you want. And she said, oh, okay, she would. And I always tell people it's a fairly light airplane. So I said, I always tell people, use 3 fingers. She said, okay, I will. And then she grabbed like this, two fists. And I tried to encourage her to relax, but nope, she was happy with that. So I felt like she was holding the airplane in the sky just by holding on to it firmly. But I think you're absolutely right. Trying to assess your audience, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, you can sense anxiety, and so you kind of have to respond to that and try to make it as smooth as possible if you can tell they're angry. One sign I've seen before of anxiety is people get excited and say, "Oh, this is fun! This is great! Let's do more!" And they get kind of wild with happiness, and then the next thing they do is throw up. So you kind of have to be aware of that over enthusiasm also.
Isn't there a period of quietness before they throw up, though?
Often, yeah, you can time it.
Yes. That's my experience.
There's Heinz. You're here with us. I was listening to some of the Jay Neber's presentation. Now, I came away concluding I don't ever want to take a check ride again.
That's good. That's a good takeaway. No, it was good stuff. Hopefully they'll record it and I can pick up on the end.
Sure. So
yeah, I'm still trying to find the first one. I missed this is one of 3 that he's presenting. I missed the first one, and someplace I'm sure it's available. I don't know where.
He did not record that one. I asked him, and I've been the person putting stuff up on the YouTube channel, and he didn't. And I think last night Philip's presentation on X-Plane, Heinz was able to attend that one. I think Heinz's impression was it did not get recorded. So it's kind of unfortunate, but.
I think I voiced my concern earlier. If this has no password, that it could get bombed by somebody signing up and then putting their own video on. And that happened to Celeste, my wife Celeste, last night or the night before with a big statewide presentation with 250 people, all about bees. But somebody after 40 minutes came in and just started putting pornography or something on the screen. And so without a password, I'm a little worried somebody might bust, but nobody cares about that.
So, I mean, for my stuff, I would find that very entertaining, quite frankly.
You're in the Marines. So.
Well, in a sense, we sort of have a password in that our the address for these meetings goes up on a club website. It's not,
Right.
the website itself is not password protected. Anybody who stumbles on it could access it. But I think that screens out a lot of people. Hope so anyway.
Yeah.
Time will tell.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if we start to have a problem with it, we can change practices, but so far so good.
Yeah. Well, sorry for Celeste. It must have been disruptive.
Well, they turned, everybody just left and then they came back together later, I think, something like that.
Yeah.
Or turn off the video and just did audio.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that works too. So, well, what we have here is a group of people who are highly informed. Most of us are instructors, and so I was hoping we would have some people who were curious but had not given a lot of thought to this in the past, and maybe didn't know the whole history of it. I was doing a little reading, and there are a lot of colorful stories about spins in the early days. There was a gentleman who was largely credited with making the first recovery from a spin way back in like 1912 or something. A lieutenant named Wilfred Parks, and he apparently accidentally installed an Avro Type G biplane. I'm sure John could give us the whole history of that. I have not a clue what that would look like, but he entered an inadvertent spin and recovered shortly before he hit the ground somewhere in England. The interesting thing is that 5 or 6 years later, he died in an inadvertent spin from which his recovery was not as successful. And there are great stories about the Wright brothers having accidental, no one had a term for it then, but in retrospect, it sounds a little bit like a spin, an inadvertent departure from flight. And that's when they seized upon the idea of a fully functional rudder as a means of arresting that motion. And that was an interesting story. But we all know spins were a thing in flight training. We could go on and talk about it for a long time, but up until about 1949, when the FAA decided no more, and there were actually congressional hearings about that very idea, whether spins should be reinserted into private pilot training. And somewhere you can actually find proceedings from those hearings, and it's pretty interesting, but it basically just boils down to the fact that the FAA made the case that spins had certainly been a problem, as they remain to this day, but that the spins that were killing people were all at such a low altitude that a trained aerobatic pilot would not be able to recover. And hence the emphasis ever since on spin avoidance, stall and spin avoidance. And they took the point of view that the kind of spin training that most of us have done just teaches you how to do spins, doesn't protect you from the hazards of a spin. And but the argument goes on and on. I am told we have a bunch of glider pilots here. I'm told that spin training is required for glider instructors. Is that true, Jim, Hines, John?
I don't, it sounds right, but I can't confirm that.
Okay. The argument was that, and you can explain the aerodynamics of this to me. The argument was that sailplanes fly closer to the stall typically than powered airplanes do. Does that make sense? Is that because of the glide ratio of them? Is it because, does that make sense?
I'll give you my opinion on this, and yes, that makes sense. Generally, when you're cruising and cross-country soaring, you're not flying close to stall speed. You're doing best L over D or even faster according to the conditions, so you get there quicker. Where you slow up is when you're thermaling. And when
Right.
you're thermaling, you want to go minimum sync, which typically is very close to stall speed. So you have the lowest sync and the max advantage of the thermal. So it's not unusual in a thermal that you're really on the edge of stall as you're trying to manage that.
And furthermore, and a lot of thermals are not smooth either, so it's bumpy a little bit, and airspeed varies a little bit, and yeah, minimum sync is right close. Got it. I agree.
Okay. All right. So, and this actually, I got interested in this listening to Jim and Hines and Jane Ewing, right? Is her last name?
It's
Hines,
Jane Ewing Reed.
Ewing Reed. Okay.
Right. So her maiden name's Ewing. She married Frank Reed, and they're since no longer married, but I think she keeps the name.
Okay. But Hines and Jim and Jane did a really enjoyable presentation on glider flying earlier this week on Tuesday. But the most interesting part of it was the after party, where Jim and Jane started talking about stalls in gliders. And Jim, what is different? I mean, we all know a stall is an excessive angle of attack, but just in the nature of it, what is different about stalls in a sailplane?
I don't see any difference other than particular aircraft. One might be a little different from another, but basic dynamics or the basic physics is the same, I believe.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Sure. Well, John,
and just to add to that, you know, George, I know when you teach stalls, you really emphasize a reduction of angle of attack as the first thing in stall recovery. And that's all you've got in a sailplane for stall recovery. So from that point, it's the same, and it really emphasizes those basic aerodynamics.
well, going back to 30 years ago, I cannot tell you how many times I've heard John in his ground school say, if you want to understand aerodynamics, forget that you have an engine, because it's all about the wing. Well, and some other control surfaces too. So.
Well, I was going to say that another difference in sailplane stalls is the aspect ratio length of the wing versus the moment arm of the rudder. So they're carefully designed to be able to recover from stalls and spin, excuse me. But the shorter wing in general aviation makes a big difference in how long it takes in some cases to get out of a spin.
Just because more rotation?
More moment arm. You know, sometimes, 18 meters of it is swinging around the sides as opposed to half that in a powered airplane. And the fuselage is not that much longer.
Okay, so that would make it harder to stop the rotation.
Yeah, it takes a little longer in my years and years and years ago experience.
Right, okay. Well, it's kind of why we don't do spins in twins, right?
Yeah.
Are spins easier to get into or harder to get into in a sailplane?
I'd say a little harder because you're just aware of such more. The noise over the canopy. I mean, this is my memory when I used to fly sailplanes, but you're much more aware of the aerodynamics tactily and auditorily, and a lot of that's masked in an airplane.
Well, I would say that the physics involved is the same for all aircraft, but the variables have to do with things like aspect ratio, the mass distribution, the size of the control surfaces, how far they are from the center of gravity, and any other little aerodynamic quirks. So really, it's an unknown for any particular aircraft until somebody goes out and empirically gathers the data and tests it and finds out. So you don't know what's going to happen until you or somebody else has done it. And in the same aircraft, in different center of gravity and different configurations could be different. So it's really an unknown. And it's great that there are some aircraft that seem to be pretty predictable and recover in the same manner, or act the same way about every time. So you hope those are the ones you use to demonstrate spins and spin recoveries. But it's not for sure. If you change anything, then you're the test pilot.
I remember one time many years ago, I was at Oshkosh, just wandering around on the grounds one day, and it started to rain. And I ducked into a tent just to get out of the rain. And I'm listening to I came in the middle of it, and I didn't know who I was. What?
Kirshner?
I did not know who was talking, but there's a gentleman up there talking about, ultimately talking about spins. And of course, I ducked in there thinking, I'm just getting out of the rain. This is boring. I know everything there is about how to spin an airplane. And then I started listening, and I heard him say, well, in my Aerobat 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in the 14th turn, it tended to go a little flat. But then in the 17th turn, the rotation sped up a little bit. But if I used a little opposite aileron, it would lift the nose a little bit, and I could make it almost go flat. And I thought, okay, I'm just along for the ride. I just realized, that, yeah.
So that was Bill Kirshner. That was Kirshner.
It was Bill Kirshner.
He had his Wilbur and Orville were the names for his 150s, and one of them is up in the Smithsonian, I believe.
Yeah.
But he tells the story that when I heard him speak, and he was in Asheboro speaking once, of that he periodically checks his airplanes in his spin school there, in all kinds of ways, in terms of make sure the center of gravity is right where he thinks it is. He's looking for loose fairings and anything that will disturb an airflow. He has it all just nailed down, and he said the scary part is that you can do about 25 or 30 spins in a row and multiple turns, and everything works out just like you expect it to. The periodic lowering of the nose comes up, it goes back down. He's used to all that, no problem. He says every now and then it just does something different. Like I don't know what the number was, every 20 spins or something. He says it'll just stay in a flat place for a while, and it takes some thinking and trying hard to get out. And he says, and as soon as I get in the ground, I check, I measure, nothing's loose, the CG's perfectly where it's supposed to be. And he says, I don't know why. And I didn't know what to take home from that, but that was quite stuck in my head.
One of the points well taken is what I've seen in reports from other people spinning is that any small change in the aircraft, the airframe or fairings, as you say, in fact, something like I see in the glider world anyway, people gluing on camera mounts like GoPro plastic, little small flat thing, but out on a wingtip. And that kind of thing has been demonstrated to make a difference. So I'm a little leery of anything modified on the airplane.
So to your point of small changes, back when the RV6 was designed, it came away with a certain set of spin characteristics, and they were happy with them. The plane would recover within Part 23 aerobatic limits. And then they designed the RV7, which is really just a slightly redesigned RV6. But they widened the cabin just a couple inches, not much in the way of changes. And when they went to test fly it and do the spin testing, it was not recovering as fast. They don't really know why. Small changes to the airframe is all that was done. But they came out and they gave the 7 a slightly bigger rudder because they wanted those same spin recovery characteristics. But to your point, Jim, small changes can have noticeable differences.
I'm not sure if this is the appropriate time to ask the question. My Ronca Champ spins easily, recovers easily. To get advice on that, I talked to to a guy named Bill Pancake, who's the leading champ expert in the United States, probably the world. A great guy. And so when I got the airplane, I talked to Bill and I said, hey, you know, I'm interested in spinning this. And he told me it's a story about doing like 60 spins to get down out of mountain wave and all that stuff. But here's something he said that I filed, but I don't understand. He said, if you get into a spin, here's the recovery procedures. It's a little different from what I was used to, but not unusual. But he says, if that doesn't work, position the ailerons in the direction of the spin, and that will help you get out of it. So for our spin experts, what would that do, and why would that make a difference?
I don't have a direct answer, but I know such things can make it, the control positions make a big difference in the recovery. So it makes sense, but I can't tell you why.
Well, it's what I teach is the control's neutral, right? Because you don't want to do opposite because that aggravates the spin, et cetera. But moving the ailerons in the direction of the spin, I don't know why that would make a difference. But coming from the source, I'm pretty sure it does.
I have heard that recommended as a means of breaking a flat spin.
Well, maybe that's what he was talking about.
And I'd have to stop and think about the theory behind that. But it's
By
certainly
the way,
counterintuitive.
Heinz, this Pancake fellow, is that the guy that has the maintenance shop over there at Triangle North?
No, that's Pancake.
No.
That's Rick Pancake.
Yeah,
Pancake, okay.
no, Pancake's a West Virginia guy. Talks like Chuck Yeager.
I've heard the name. I didn't realize that's what it was. The only thing I can think of is that you effectively reduce the angle of attack on the more stalled wing by raising the aileron on that side. I mean, if that's what you're talking about, and whether that.
I think that's probably it.
Yeah.
Well, and you're going to also increase some drag on the outboard wing with the downgoing aileron. And so maybe that's a piece of it as well. I don't know.
Yeah. I somewhere I ran across that as a possible means of breaking a flat spin, but I'm not sure what the rest of it was.
Well, you heard Jane Reed talk about flat spin in a Grobe last night, last night. And the same thing, I think Georgia recognized the story of the FAA certification flight, and I said I thought it was a Grumman, but I think you're right. It was one of those Piper Tomahawks where the pilots had to change the CG in order to recover from a flat spin. They had to unbuckle and move their body weight forward.
And that Tomahawk's got that T-tail just like the Grobe does.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, and I've heard that one of the things I've been told and read, one of the things that makes a flat spin difficult if it's inadvertent is that it does tend to, in some way, the airflow over the wings tends to make the rudder less effective and more difficult to stop the rotation. Don't know.
Well, my conclusion is this is all speculation, and just sort of my personal rule is I don't want to spin anything unless it's a well-proven design and has been thoroughly spin tested, and I got lots of altitude, and double check the center of gravity, make sure that's within limits, because that's the fear of going flat, maybe because of the center of gravity out of limits. And who knows, when that Grobe that Jane reported, maybe there was some weight somewhere they didn't know about that got them out of limits. So sort of my approach to it is, don't unless a lot of things, and one of those may be an egress system, and you can recover even if with a parachute, even if the glider doesn't, but you need lots of altitude for that. I think really more the point, my interest in this discussion is, how much is appropriate to show a student pilot as far as exposure to spins or spin recoveries. And I believe both the glider PTS and the airplane ACAs both just give verbal service to spins. And all you have to do is to talk about what they are and how to recover. You don't have to really demonstrate anything. And I think Jane's point, which I was glad to hear because it kind of matches my perspective and other people I see in the glider program, is that even though it's not required, we do want to show students what it's like when you stall and put in pro spin controls, and that wing and nose drop is dramatic and it's drastic, and it's something I feel it's irresponsible not to show students, before they get their license. And they may go up in our single place student glider, spins easily and recovers well. So even though what I'm doing is going beyond the requirements for a check ride, the FAA requirements, I still think it's kind of irresponsible not to let them know that such a drastic change of attitude could happen, and to see it at least once. And so far, people have been, agreeable to that.
Well, I think this is an interesting subject, because this is what I have talked about for years, and I think that's grist for the mill of what we might do tonight, and that is the psychology of the student. Back up, when George talks about the case that the FAA made not to teach spins in the private pilot curriculum, I talked to a lot of people near that time when that happened. It was very controversial. All of the instructors that I knew were World War II vets, and they were just outraged that something so stupid would have been done to cancel this requirement. But on the other hand, the FAA has, and I'm convinced, been proven right by the statistics. After that was put into effect, the stall spin accidents, especially those involving death, has gone way down. And concurrently, Canada kept it for, I forget how many more years. Their rate stayed high until they got rid of it. And so it was the right call. So your question is really to the point, Jim. How much do you expose people to, and does it give them, many of them, a false confidence that, hey, if this ever happens, no problem. I've seen it once, I'll handle it, and then they don't? Or is it useful to really see? And should we make the distinction between an incipient spin and developed spin? Does that make a difference of the exposure too? So I can say more, but I'll stop there. I'm just curious what you all think.
Well, I do have a response to that. In incipient versus well-developed, there is a natural curiosity many of us have. It's kind of like I'm on the farm and I got the tractor revved up and let's see what she'll do. I think it's normal to be curious about the characteristics of the aircraft and what's going to happen. Yeah. Normal for some of us, and right. That's an okay interest, but it is beyond the FAA regulations, beyond the FAA requirements, beyond what you are required to demonstrate on a check ride. So it's really out of place, I think, in a private or a commercial curriculum to add on a personal interest in the subject, unless the student has that interest too. And maybe it should be pointed out, if you extend your flight training, the number of flights and the expense, if you extend it to do more spins, then it's a different program, and you're assuming the student is interested and going to pay for it. So we really don't have any right to assume the student wants that. And on the other side, look at where we're going in general in society. We're going to autonomous cars, right? And drones that they're going to fly us around like a taxi but have no pilot. So flight control design and aircraft characteristics have advanced so far that someday we may get to the holy grail, which is an unspinnable airplane, better than the air coupe. I mean, so it's understandable if you're going to project a plane that is spin proof, then why worry about the details of spin? So I understand that thinking. So I'll be quiet for a while.
So for years, I've been, as I said, as we started, I was fascinated with spins from the beginning, curious about them. Like you're saying, Jim, I just had a lot of curiosity. It's not something my instructor taught. He was a former Air Force primary instructor, and so he wanted just to stick to the program, get it done. So I had to go seek out someone to do spin training with. I will say, coming away from that first round of spin training, as you were talking about showing people the spin and that the wing drop and the nose drop and how surprising it is. I'm an engineer. I read a lot. I felt like I was totally prepared. I knew what was going to happen. And the only thing I could do on that very first, it was just an incipient spin, quarter turn, entry to the left, is my eyes got huge and I gasped. And if that had been me, on my own, it would have been bad news. But I have to say, coming away from that 1 hour-and-a-half session, was I prepared to go out and spin on my own? No, absolutely not. It whetted my appetite, but it did not teach me enough where I could or did even go try on my own. But it did leave me curious. So over years, people have asked me, oh, should we do spin training in primary instruction? And as much as I'm fascinated by it personally, my answer has been no. And what I've ended up telling people is, okay, finish your private, learn the basics. And if you're still really curious, if you're one of these people who is curious and interested, then go seek it out from someone who can give you good instruction. But, I don't claim that it's for everybody. I kind of wish it was, because I feel like understanding the further edges of the aircraft's capabilities is just good knowledge. But I have to admit, I don't think it's for everybody.
I agree.
Yeah, well said. It's really an extra people have to seek out and pay for. Yeah, I'm looking at this chart, and that's a nice descending curve, although I would have thought maybe there'd be a jump when the FAA quit requiring spins on check rides.
That's the first portion of that. That's
yeah.
That's the steepest angle there. Yep.
And also, John, as you pointed out, John, it's hard on the gyros. If you have an airplane that has gyro instruments, it tears them up.
It's very true.
That's why you used to be able to cage them, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Well, and that's something that I'll just get back to this a little bit. The fear factor that comes in unless you're thoroughly versed in them is an issue, as Dwight has just mentioned. Even though you think you know what's coming, you don't. And there have been a number of cases, and Jim or Heinz, you maybe remember this. I think it was about 15 years ago in soaring. There was a write-up of a CFIG out west somewhere in the mountains, I forget where. And he was working in evening thermal on a low slope near the glider port. He wasn't worried about it. It was, the sun was setting. It was one of those lazy evenings when the evening thermals come up. And he was just about ready to turn back to the field, and all of a sudden lost complete control of his glider. And this is an experienced instructor who taught spins, if I recall the article correctly. His shtick was to teach spins in sailplanes. And he went into the woods. He was in the hospital, and he was interviewed by the FAA initially. And his first, as he wrote the article, as I recall, he said, my first reaction was to say, have you a chance to examine the airplane? Was it a control failure? It felt like a control failure to me. All of a sudden, we were just diving into the woods. And then in his article, he said, now later I had to realize I just got into a spin. Me of all persons went into a spin and did not react appropriately when it happened, and I was too low and went into the woods. So the issue of being surprised by a spin is always, to me, extremely critical. It's one thing to train, where you brief it, you go up there, you say, here's what's going to happen, here's what we're going to do, follow through, now you do it, I'll watch, and you do all this. How is that for many people, at least? Maybe that's exactly right for some, but unless they practice and keep up in it, and it's recently in their experience, is that really useful? And that's what I think the FAA was arguing about, way back in the argument, that when it actually does happen, if they have enough training to take the fear away, and then all of a sudden when it does happen, they freak out and it's all over. I mean,
I think you're alluding to really the same as the dreaded base final skidding turn, it can get
Right.
people, even if they're experienced, something happens a few hundred feet above the ground, and no matter how good you are at spin recovery, you're
Yeah.
still going to come to grief.
Right. Right.
Well, I think there's frequently this fantasy that spin training will inoculate you against
Right.
that particular problem, or that it'll give you the experience you need to recover. And I think it is just a fantasy. At that altitude, even experienced people will take a few moments to recognize what's happened.
Yeah.
And those few moments, take away any time you have to actually recover. And if you're doing a base to final turn,
Right.
you're 500 feet AGL or thereabouts. You're not going to recover. So while I'm a big fan of spin training, I actually actively would like to do spin training with people. I would like to disabuse people of the idea that it'll save them from that, because I just don't think it will.
I've got one question along those lines for our experienced instructors here. I have heard for some people, of course, we know that a lot of new students are really anxious about stall training, and they don't want to get into it. And I've heard that for some of those students to actually demonstrate spins is kind of a what's the worst that can happen? Here it is, and here we survived is helpful. What are your thoughts on that?
Mine's brings back to mind an old Far Side cartoon. There's a guy in a phone booth, and the phone booth is hanging from a crane about 15 stories up, and it's full of snakes. And the caption is Dr. Schwartz's controversial phobia cure. Yeah, I mean, I love doing stall training with people who are apprehensive about it, in part because my first instructor was a terrible instructor in so many ways. And he was terrified of stalls. And he passed that along to me. His way of teaching me stalls was to get the airplane nose high, and then he's flying the airplane and say, okay, show me a stall, and I would pull and then I would push, and I had no idea what I was doing. And then he would immediately grab the controls and utter a profanity, and we'd fly on, and he'd say, okay, that's good. It was a terrible disservice to me. So I love flying with people who have that apprehension. And you remember when you and I flew, we talked about introducing stalls in a way that will, I think, help people get over that anxiety and that apprehension. And I think that's very useful. And in fact, what I do with primary students introducing stalls is not that much different than spin training. We just don't do the next 4 turns. And you can call it stall training. You can call it, in Canada, there's a license, recreational type license, much as the recreational license we used to have here till it turned into a non-starter. And I understand that for that, they are required to do a stall and drop a wing. So is that stall training? Is that incipient spin training? Is that, it becomes kind of a matter of semantics after a while. When I do spins with people, once we're very comfortable with them in the way that, you and I started out demonstrating, we drop a wing and then maybe it rotates a turn or so. Stuff happens. But by that time, they're so comfortable with it and they understand that it's controllable. And it takes a lot of the anxiety away. And I think we do have a responsibility to help people with that. Long-winded answer, but
Yeah. And I would agree with that. I think haven't you all had students where every now and then somebody is so rigorous about coordination of the airplane? I mean, the ball is glued between the lines, and you're doing stall training, and the temptation is to, okay, let's do another one, you know, on a power on stall, and then you just very surreptitiously lean on the rudder just a little bit, you know, to the left, and then see what happens. So I think it's very appropriate to have everybody experience what I always call the wing drop, where you're looking at the world 90 degrees, and you know what to do. Relax the back pressure, push the opposite rudder, just do it, and let that be through the spinal column. Don't think about it, just do it. Is that what you're saying, George?
Well, yeah, I am. And, you know, it's a little bit like the recent kerfuffle over slow flight. The FAA now says that we do not want people demonstrating slow flight with the stall warning sounding.
Yep.
Because their new theory is that it will inure people to a warning that should alert them, if not horrify them. And so they want us to teach people slow flight, or they want slow flight demonstrated. It's sort of slow, but not so slow that the stall warning is sounding. You know, the FAA can tell me how my student should demonstrate a maneuver on a check ride. It can't really tell me how I should teach that student. And I'm going to teach people to fly literally on the brink of a stall. I want them to have that ability. But then you tell them, when you go take your check ride, don't fly that slow. It upsets the FAA. And there's probably an acronym for that too, Jim. But yeah, I want people to be really comfortable with it, and I don't think it makes them hazardous. I think it makes them more confident in the airplane. And on the other hand, the reason I don't want people spinning our airplanes is because they have such benign stall characteristics that, you know, 152, if it is reasonably and legally loaded, is damn hard to keep in a spin. I mean, you have to be extremely aggressive about pro spin inputs. If you relax the back pressure, the slightest amount, I mean, an amount that most people wouldn't even be conscious of, it starts flying again. And now the airspeed's going through the red line, and the prop's overspeeding, and they don't recognize that they're not in a spin anymore, because they're going around and around, and they're going down, and it looks like they're going straight down. Of course they're not, but and they will just sit there as the engine red lines and not recognize. And remember, Heinz, when we were doing that, we were feeling for that moment when the airplane comes out of the stall, and you can sort of feel it give a little shudder and then accelerate. But that's about all that you notice if you're not, and most people are so tense at that point, they don't notice those little indications. That's my biggest concern with people going out and doing spins on their own.
Jim, that might be an advantage of spin training in a glider like the 233, in that it's so draggy that, you know, when you transition from spin to spiral dive, the acceleration is not so much, and you have less consequences and more time to react to it.
Oh, that's not been my experience. Our 233, with the kind of loading we usually have with a student, won't stay in a spin. It kind of comes out of it, and not just in a spiral dive. It'll start oscillating, you know, enter spiral dive, but then begin oscillating in pitch, and it builds up then, and it builds up speed real fast, and it's only got a 98 mile per hour red line. Okay. So that's kind of the big risk I'm watching for, is if we come out of a spin and then in the recovery, that airspeed starts taking off towards the red line. So you got to use full spoilers and, you know, judicious pull out.
So it's worse. So much for that theory. How about the Blaniks?
The Blaniks, well, that's been a while since I've flown them, but the Lark, I had not spun it much, only enough to enter and do a turn. And by the way, we're talking about terms of the language. And back when I worked for the Navy, they had, departure for controlled flight and stall, and then post-stall gyrations, incipient spins, and then steady state spins, which then could turn oscillatory or take on other characteristics. So you can divide it all up into all sorts of phases there.
NASA has 6 stages of a spin.
Yeah. But another related point, or perhaps another topic, exiting the spin and knowing the difference between the spin and the spiral dive. And as Jane said in the glider presentation, well, if the airspeed's going up, then you're in a spiral dive, not a spin. But in the glider club, we had a presentation recently, by Dr. Z, who's, I don't know what his real name is, but he's an expert pilot. And the descending spiral in the spiral mode of an aircraft, where you're not spinning, but just straight and level or in a medium bank turn, and you let go of the controls, and often it will gradually increase bank and increase airspeed. And so what happens if you let it go? And the spiral behavior can be diverging, so that the more you let it go, the faster it gets and the steeper it gets, such that eventually the wings come off or something bad happens. It can be converging, so that either flies out of it by itself or reaches a steady state, a steady bank angle, and in a controllable airspeed, especially if you have full spoilers on, where it'll stabilize in a descending spiral without increasing speed. And sort of the myth is that if you're stuck above a cloud layer, then you could use that to descend through the cloud layer, well, even without having any gyros. But to me, that's a very related area of investigation for flying, whether it's the spin itself or the spiral dive. It's important to kind of keep that distinction, make sure the students know if the airspeed's coming up fast, then you better level the wings and pull out. What are we looking at here? A NASA report?
Oh yeah, this is just something I found when I wrote a rant for the club newsletter a while back about why we should not be teaching spins. And as I just said, you could make the argument that I am teaching spins. I just don't call it that. For one thing, I found that if you take a student out and tell them, okay, we're gonna learn spins, they get all excited and they come back and they tell all their friends, oh man, we were spinning the airplane. And then all their friends go out and try and spin the airplane. And I looked at a survey of stall spin accidents over about the last 30 years or so. And you wouldn't believe there were something like 43 stall spin accidents over a 30-year span. And some of my favorites were a student pilot who decided to go out, and I didn't seen the whole NTSB report, but he went out and decided to see if he could get his training airplane in a flat spin, and he succeeded. And after about 20 turns, he hit the ground. There was another one where a CFI was flying with a student, I guess it was a CFI student, and pronounced that his instructional knowledge, as the FAA likes to call it, of spins was insufficient. And the student didn't want to pay for another lesson, and the instructor didn't want to spin the student's airplane, so the student took his own airplane out and spun it, and of course lost control and hit the ground. But this was just, I thought it was interesting. NASA did a lot of, some years ago in the 70s, did a lot of research into different, they call them modes of spins, and this is angled attack. A steep spin, they called it, was a 20 to 30 degree angle attack. And I think the model they were using had about an 18-degree critical angle attack. And so then you get up to a 65 to 90-degree angle of attack. And they call that a flat spin. I'm not sure what a 90-degree angle of attack would look like. But
And the steep there refers to the pitch attitude as opposed to the given angle of attack. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I mean, it's a lower angle of attack, which produces a steeper
Got it.
attitude of
Got
the airplane. And then you get up to a very high angle of attack, and you're talking about what in the vernacular we call a flat spin.
Got it.
Yeah, I think that's what we're all afraid of, is a spin going flat and becoming unrecoverable. There's another aspect that if there's a question on the floor about whether to teach spins or not, there's, the FAA often has precise regulations, and then some are very subjective. So the definition of acrobatics in the FAR is subjective. It talks about things that are not normal for necessary for normal flight. So what's normal? That can be probably best defined by the judge or the jury in a after accident lawsuit or something. And so really, we're not supposed to do acrobatics beyond certain angles of attack or pitch angles, roll attitudes without parachutes.
60 degrees bank, 30 degrees
60
of
and
pitch.
30. And often spins will exceed that. And yet often people don't use parachutes for spin. There's spin training, spin practice. And of course, there's that regulation that, well, you don't need them for CFI spin training. But often this type of spin training, with beginner pilots, I think was done without parachutes. So there you're really, pushing a limit of a FAR in that you can interpret it the way you want. Maybe you could argue, well, in the future there may be an instructor sometime, but you're down into where you have to defend your action. And on the other side of the courtroom is the FAA and the NTSB, and they're not going to take anything other than the tightest view of the regulation. So that's just another reason that you're really contrary to what the FAA wants if you do instruct spin training, unless it's in a approved aircraft with parachutes.
Yeah, that's long been a controversy, but it's well established in case law with the FAA now. And this is literally taken directly out of a book that is a collection of cases referring to the various FARs. And the parachute is required for 60-degree bank, 30-degree of pitch, up or down. But the requirement, the Part 91307, which requires parachutes, makes an exception for spins under the flight required by the regulation for any certificate of rating when given by a flight instructor. And case law has ruled that it does not have to be the certificate of rating for which you are training.
Yeah, well, thank you. I realized now I had seen that before, but I was just bringing that discussion up, which is good to remind me.
But yeah, it is clearly an exception to the rule requiring parachutes. It's just been established in case law by now.
Well, I think last night I alluded to in the glider presentation, there's some parts of the FARs that I'm a little worried about pushing up against, and this was one of them, although now I remember I've seen this before, that you don't need parachutes for spin training. But the other one is formation flying, and in gliders often, if you get a thermal and somebody else sees you, you got lift, they come over and join you. Now you got two aircraft circling in close proximity, and the formation regulation talks about you have to brief ahead of time about that, but gliders do it all the time with no more pre-briefing other than, we'll see you up there kind of. So I'm aware of the legality of a lot of this.
Well, yeah, you don't know who you're going to meet in the next thermal.
Right.
I'll say in the context of glider contests, those, thermal etiquette and how that works is normally pretty well briefed. It's just when we do it informally and ad hoc at our airports, we don't do that.
Yeah, and that's come about recent years. When I used to go to national glider contests back in the 60s, you would hear arguments almost every night of why were you circling in the opposite direction that I was, and it would be troublesome.
So do you make all turns to the left or something? What?
Yeah,
First person.
in general, standard contest rules are in vicinity of of an airport. All turns are to the left, and then if you join a gaggle, you don't start a new turn. You join whatever turn is going on in that gaggle, etc. So all that stuff's pretty well understood, but not necessarily at my home airport where we just kind of all go ad hoc when we do these things. I want to change subject a little bit with our experienced flight instructors, and just in general, I enjoy teaching stalls. I think spins are a lot of fun. I think the discussion we've had about why they might not be good training ideas makes a lot of sense to me. I guess just a caveat. I think a lot about an accident that happened a few years ago. Is a good friend of mine, very experienced airline pilot, flying a glider, and got low and slow coming back to the airport, stall spinned in and survived, but it was a bad accident. And I looked at that and I go, I've flown with this guy in little airplanes before, and he was a damn good pilot. He is a damn good pilot, better than I am. And so that guy just spun in, and he's better than I am. So what did he see that I don't see, and what caused that? And I'm firmly convinced the things that I teach to my students in terms of stall recovery and the times that we do spins, spin entry and recovery, et cetera, is not what he saw. If you think about the way that we teach spins, it's, you're high, which is good and important, but you have a fairly scripted way of entering it, even if you're entering into a turn. And sure enough, the spin, you feel the spin indications, as the FAA likes us to announce, okay, there's the buffet, there's the horn, there's the buffet, here's the brake, and then maybe a wing drops, and that's all according to plan. And it's pretty obvious to me that what kills a lot of people in this base to final thing is not that. It's something else. It's something that experienced pilots don't see happening until the stall and the spin happens. And we all know if you're at a couple hundred feet, you're just not, the best pilot's not going to recover from that. So my question is, forget about teaching spins. To teach the stall, to prepare for that, how can we do that better?
Heinz, this is something that people say to me all the time. I think when you and I flew together, I don't know how much time we had, but I always, with CFI candidates, we always try to replicate those infamous situations, the accelerated stall and noticeably the base to final infamous stall. It's hard as hell in the training airplanes we fly. You have to brutally handle the airplane to generate that base to final stall in the airplanes we fly. And everybody looks at me and says, I would never do that. I would never fly like that. And it doesn't add up for them. And yet, the situations like your friend and, you see these accidents. I'm looking at statistics today. I saw that most stall spin accidents are committed by private and commercial pilots, very few by student pilots, very few by ATPs. It's kind of the middle ground there. Now, it may just be that there are more of those pilots. Statistics are interesting to look at, but I don't know what's been your guys' experience. I bet 100 times I've tried to demonstrate to people the infamous base to final stall spin.
Well, George, you and I, we worked on that for about a dozen attempts and finally found some combination of pitch and power and everything that got a base to final skidding turn spin, right? And we really had to work at it. That 152 did not want to do it.
No.
Well, do you remember us trying to do that in the Satabria?
Oh yeah.
We got to the point where if you go into it slowly, like, you can envision someone going through that chain of logic of, I've overshot, yada, 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 right?
Sure.
We were both pulling on me in the front seat, you in the back, pulling the stick into the back corner. Couldn't make it do it. It seems the only way we could make it do it is if we made those control input changes fast. If we did it,
What if instead of doing the fast input controls, you were doing those kind of controls, but you were in some turbulence or did a wind shear layer?
that I could conceivably see that changing things.
This has been an ongoing mystery for me, because Heinz, I don't doubt a bit what you're telling me about your friend, and I'll just stipulate he's a far more experienced pilot than I am, and I have tried so many times in all of the airplanes that we fly to generate that, and it's just
have you tried it from a really slow speed?
Oh yeah.
I mean, starting off just above the stall.
Oh yeah.
Then rapidly maneuvering, quickly.
Yeah, obviously at altitude, but
yes.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It'd be interesting to try that though, where you did have a shear layer. I just know how many times I've come into Sanford, and you might be just above pattern altitude. You might have 25 knots of a tailwind, and it says the winds are calm on the runway.
I always caution people at night. That's a very common phenomenon.
Yeah, it is.
Because you have that boundary layer that forms at night. But,
yeah, but I'm not going to run that experiment at that altitude.
No, but I mean, if you find a wind shear layer up at 3,000 or 4,000 feet or something.
Yeah, you'd have to.
The wind shear, that's a good example, and that definitely can aggravate those kinds of conditions. I think there is a thing, and I don't fully understand it, but I think there is a thing in terms of the visuals at low altitudes and the psychology of it that makes you do things a little differently than you do at altitude.
Yeah.
You're low, so you have a strong urge to pull back on the stick to stretch a glide when you know better, but because you're close to the ground now, there's powerful visual cues that make you want to do that. And then you're in a turn situation where your visual perception gives you a perception that your angle of attack is not as great as it really is, given the nature of the turn, the wing rotation, and all those kinds of factors. And it's the visuals of what all that looks like low to the ground that I think we're missing from our high altitude stalls training.
John,
yeah.
In a minute, I want to come back to this because it is pertinent here, I think. You remember the kerfuffle that you and I got into, mostly you, with the famous aviation author over the accident in the Cirrus, which was a stall spin. Yep. We're going to come back to that in a minute because that's fascinating. And we have got to do that demonstration with the postal scale and put it on YouTube. If I die without doing that, I'm going to come back from the grave. I swear to God.
Yeah.
That was just the coolest thing ever. So in a minute, I want you to describe that. So,
I want to go back to what, and just for whatever it's worth, the idea that the FAA has come out and said that we don't want you to fly around with a stall warning horn and ignore it. That's been a concern a long time for me. So I don't know whether it's good or bad, but what I've ended up doing the last couple of years I instructed was to brief it ahead of time, and then all the practice stalls we did would be done this way. We'd brief we're going to do, then we go up there and then try the first one out. And the first one would be to slow down to the stall warning horn and say, there's a warning horn, push forward, and do it. And then the next one would say, there's a stall warning horn, I am purposely not going to push forward, I'm going to continue to pull. So to make it very, very mental, but the first exercise always, I hear the stall warning, I push. So I don't know whether that's helpful or not, but it's been a concern for me a long time. And you hear these crazy things every now and then when the guy with landing with the gear up, for instance, a classic, it was a Bonanza some time ago, he's talking to controller. The controller is hearing this warning horn going on the back and on the background. It's going on. It's just on, and the guy lands with the gear up. I mean, just like
you can find videos of that on YouTube.
Yeah,
guys coming down the final, literally saying to each other, "What's that noise? Oh, I don't know. We'll figure it out later."
right.
Literally.
And they do figure it out later.
To figure it out later.
Very, very shortly, in fact.
The noise gets louder. And then I've got my theories about that too, but that's another conversation. All this talk about gliders is really interesting to me because, there's sort of a theory now that a lot of these stall accidents that we're seeing in airline flying, particularly, remember a few years back, all those ATRs were getting iced up in Illinois and falling out of the sky, and the infamous Colgan crash. And there's this theory that a lot of this ab initio training, these days you can go to ATP or Republic's flight school and start at zero, and 18 months later you're flying a regional jet for Republic, and that they are teaching people in Skyhawks to just push the throttles up and fly out of an incipient stall, which is why jets have stick pushers and stick shakers. And they are not teaching people that at some point, even if it's a swept wing jet, you have no choice but to push the nose down and reduce the angle of attack. And I remember the NTSB put up an animation of that Colgan crash, and you had an external view of the airplane. This was an animation. It was a cartoon airplane, and an internal view of the controls. And you could see that when the airplane started to shudder, beginning to stall in the external view, you could see in the internal view, throttles went all the way forward and the stick went all the way back. And they stayed that way until they hit the ground. And so, Jim, you said early in this conversation that the one thing about doing stalls in a glider is you do have to understand it is all about the angle of attack, because you don't have an engine to complicate the thought process.
One thing I'd like to add about this accident we had near our glider field that Heinz was referring to is the gliders that we have, or that this fellow was flying, actually have pretty mild stall characteristics. They will get, if you get into extreme angle of attack, they will buff it and the nose will drop. But more, what may be a bigger factor is just that as you get slow, you don't notice much of anything, but if you look, your rate of descent, your sink rate is going way up. So you're kind of like in an elevator, just descending right into the ground, even though you feel like you're completely under control. Now, if you throw in a little side slip with that, then you could have that entry into an incipient spin. So we're not sure exactly what happened in that accident, but I suspect something like that happened. It got slow and then kind of developed a sink rate into the ground.
Interesting. Well, one I remember many years ago flying with Jim Yankaskas, and in a Mooney, we did a power off precision approach from like 8 or 9 miles out. And he just gradually slowed up the airplane to increase the sink rate and put it down right on the numbers with just enough airspeed to flare. And it was in that moment I slapped my forehead and said, if you need to go down faster, pull the nose up. Obviously, it's like the old joke. You pull back on the stick and the houses get smaller, and then you keep pulling back and they get bigger.
Right.
But it taught me a lot, and to this day I use that technique for power off precision landings. It's also the only time I've ever damaged an airplane in the course of training.
Yeah. You can get an unstoppable sink rate like that. But it's just all where you are in relation to that drag curve.
Exactly.
The the opposite. In this draggy 233 we train in with gliders, is if you're way high and full spoilers won't bring you down fast enough, and if full slip won't bring you down fast enough, you can go faster. And since the drag goes up with the square of the speed, then that'll take care of it. And so hence my saying is you can never be too high at a 233.
I'll try 222.
By the way, John, I think maybe you weren't here yet, I don't know, but I appreciate your, talking to George and putting the history on the website, on the YouTube channel, the history of the club.
Yeah.
But it prompted me to go back and get my logbook from 1977, and I saw your name in there quite a few times. I think we were doing instrument training.
Right. Cool. Yes.
Jim,
that was an enjoyable time, Jim.
We'll have to do another session of that
I don't know.
with you joining us. There'd be some great stories there. So I want John to tell the story, which I tell a lot, about a kerfuffle that he got into with a well-recognized aviation writer, and it made me angry because John was disrespected, and you don't disrespect my friends. That really pisses me off. But John can tell the story better than I can, because it represents one of the most misunderstood things about aerodynamics in my mind. John, you remember that? It was an analysis of a Cirrus landing stall spin accident.
The story was that in aviation safety, they had a series of videos they did about accidents put out, I guess, on YouTube or something. This is about 15 years ago or so, maybe not YouTube then. But they were analyzing this accident, and it was out, the video they put out, they did it with the models and everything. So you had an animation to show what was happening and so forth. And the story was an instructor and a student were out in the student's Cirrus, and they were coming back in to the airport under the hood, and bungled the approach. And the instructor basically took the airplane at the last minute and stall spun, crashed it. A low turn right near the ground. Classic. Anyway, their analysis of it really disturbed me, because initially there was a maneuvering before the fact, while there was still maybe 400 or 500 feet in the air, and the statement was made, the airspeed, about the airspeed, but then they said, but if you're coming down, you can't stall.
Because you unloaded the wing because he was descending.
Yeah, he was descending and he was unloading the wing. And I thought, give me a break. I mean, so this was a nationally known magazine, a nationally known author who still, he does a lot of videos still. You see him around quite a bit. And I wrote a letter to the editor, and I said, you probably want to rethink that and correct that statement. Just because you're descending, it doesn't mean you're unloading the wing.
It was a very courteous letter, too.
Yeah. In fact, I showed it to George. I don't want to offend anybody,
Yeah.
And he came back to me and he said something like, "Well, you don't understand. You're unloading the wing and you can't stall as long as you're coming down." And I said, "Well, let's try again." And this is how I understand aerodynamics. This is how it would work. And if you started a descent and you're coming down, it does not change, the angle of attack with regard to how you're going to stall. You can stall coming down. And he tried to, one more round, he said, okay, you're wrong, basically.
And this was basically all about the concept of acceleration.
Yes.
And that was the fundamental thing that he just could not grasp. And John was so diplomatic. John wrote these letters that were of the nature of, I know you didn't mean to say this. It must have been confused in the editing. It gave all kinds of opportunity to save face. And the guy just didn't get it.
he finally just said, I'm done with this conversation, you know, but and implication, this is how I deal with quacks. And I'm just stunned. This safety guy who writes articles just didn't understand aerodynamics at all. I mean, that's, you know, so there it was.
And he basically just wrote back and said, I'm famous and you're not, bye.
Right.
And so John and I got in a 152 and we took one of those big old fashioned postage scales with the big dial on it and the spring. And we duct taped the brick on it, as I remember.
No, it was a 2-pound weight.
2-pound weight. Okay.
Yep.
It was a weight. And basically we went up and we did a steep turn, and I've forgotten whether we did a 45 or a 60-degree steep.
60-degree bank.
I hope it weighed 4 pounds then.
And
that's right. It did.
And it did
exactly. That's the whole point.
And then we did the same bank angle in a steady state descent, spiral. And guess what? It weighed the same. It weighed 4 pounds. And it was just the most perfect demonstration. You know, and we got to do that again. It was so much fun, and it was such a perfect demonstration.
Yeah, and I was thinking about photographing and sending it to him, saying, "See, it didn't unload the wing when we went this only that initial bit of acceleration when we rolled in just for a second or two, and then after that all the way down. And he was convinced if you're coming down, you couldn't stall. It unloads the wing when you come down. He just had it in his head. He's a CFI too.
Oh yeah.
Well, this thing we push and pull, the yoke or stick. You could control several things. You could say it controls the elevator position. You could say it controls pitch attitude. You could say it controls speed, or you could say it controls G's or load. So really, whatever you do with this would, help prove to this guy.
Yeah. Well, there was no discussing with him after that, but George had forgotten about that. But it is distressing that the leaders of the pack sometimes have gaps in their knowledge. And then they put out public stuff explaining, something incorrectly, trying to say for safety. It's like, oh, that's crazy.
It is a tricky concept. The idea of accelerated versus unaccelerated flight is a tricky concept, and I think it is in some ways not intuitive. I mean, it's third grade physics, but I think it's in some ways not intuitive, but he should have been way past that point.
Yeah, I agree.
And he was just rude beyond that, and I can't abide rudeness.
Yeah.
Can't forgive that. So, well, this is fascinating. I'll stay here all night. It's really fun to have you guys who have so much experience. And we're not setting policy here. One of the great things about the club is within reasonable bounds, we get to teach the way we think is most effective for our student. And as Jim said and John said, each student is different. Some need one thing, some need another, some can tolerate more than others.
Some people like spins and some people don't.
Sure. John, we all have been going on and on. This is John Hook I'm speaking to here. I hope he's still with us. He trained at the club from the beginning. John, I'd be interested in what your experience was like when it came to stalls and spins.
Well, I think, at first, stalls were something that I was very nervous about, just mostly I think because of the aircraft. The 152 will really drop a wing. And I didn't really understand that until I spent some time with Dwight, and we stalled the 172, and I thought, well, was that it? That's very benign. And in some ways it makes you realize that, we almost want to have everyone train in a plane that really will drop a wing and really shows that flight characteristic.
That's why we hate warriors.
I haven't done that yet, but we're getting there. But what's strange to me is that the 152 and the 172, as you look at it, is so very similar in how they look, but the flight characteristics are quite different. And I think in learning with Gene on the 152, and doing that minimal controllable airspeed was very important. That was the very first thing we ever did, was let's see how slow this thing can really fly. And we progressed on, and and really learning how, hey, this wing can really drop. And I think we had our pre-solo check flight with you, and I said, what happens if the wing just continues to drop? And then you said, well, can I demonstrate? And we dropped it all the way under, and you recovered, I think, in what is that, a split S? But it was that was awesome, by the way. But I think learning those things is very important. The minimal controllable airspeed, really learning that, hey, the wing is going to drop, and use your rudder to fix it. It really set me up to be very comfortable in other aircraft.
Well, I hope so. This is being recorded, so just for the record, I will say that was actually not a split S, but
I was about to get excited there, George.
Well, I don't know what you call it, but it was pretty awesome.
Sure. No. I'm really glad it helped. And when I do those stage checks with people, one of the things I want to see is if they understand the aerodynamics involved and understand what's happening. I never want to scare anybody in an airplane. I don't think that's productive, but it's an opportunity to get a sense of how well people understand stall.
And going back to the spin training, I'm convinced that if you're going to do it, you do have to do it thoroughly, to speak to Dwight's question earlier. And it has to be something that they're really comfortable doing. Because I think there are two types of people. I think there are people who, CFIs that I know, who've had spin training in theory, who are scared shitless to do spins. And they're and that's fine. They are who they are. I myself am uncomfortable to do it, because almost every time, if I do enough, especially training CFI candidates, I get sick. After about 4 or 5 turns, I think let's go back to the airport, please. So I'm not a big fan of spins, but if you are going to do it, you have to do it enough that it kind of goes through the spinal cord, and you don't have to sit there and think about it. So you have to at least get to that part of it, and also make sure that no fooling around, at or below a couple thousand feet at AGL, or certainly in pattern altitude, and just get those basic things in there.
Well, I've used that term very often because, and I think a lot of us probably do this, with students. I will put the airplane in a sort of continuous stall. You hear it called a falling leaf stall, whatever, and just have them work the rudders to keep the wings level. Sometimes I'll fly the airplane with a little power just to keep it shuddering on the brink of a stall. And I say the same thing. We're going to do that, and you're going to work the rudders so it's wired through your spinal column and not through your brain. So you're not sitting there saying, well, wait a minute, the left wing dropped, so I need to speed up the right wing. No, wait a minute, so that would require the left. No, it's got to be just absolutely instinctive. And, you can do that. There are ways you can practice that. And I think a lot of us do that with our students.
Well, I had that one experience in the Mooney that I've told you about, George, but I didn't know until later when I thought about it that I had reacted as I had. This was an experience for the rescue. I was doing a checkout in a 201 Mooney with a guy who had a lot of experience in Moonies before he came. And we were fortunately at 8,500 feet southeast of Raleigh at the time. And we're doing a power on stall, clean power on stall. And I'd coached him through it about the same thing about you hear the stall when you relax the back pressure. Then the second time he said, okay, I hear it. Okay, I'm going to pull back. Okay. And just when he sorry, it was a power off stall, clean power off stall. And just when we got to the stall, he shoved the throttle in, says, there's the stall. And he was right. And just slammed the throttle in. And we went around to the left and were essentially inverted for a second. And he immediately said, you got it, which was the right thing. And I found myself finally in an upright spin coming out of it and was pulling out at red line. And we finally pulled out at 2,500 feet, starting from 8,500 feet, which means I wasn't pulling hard enough. But it was an awful exciting thing. and thought about it later. And I'm glad I had some spin training, because I'm not sure in that initial moment when we went, the roll was, I think, about 140 degrees, and all the sand and dirt's coming down your neck from the floor, and it was a different situation than I'd ever been in before. So I credit that, because having enough training, I thought later, well, for whatever reason, we came out.
I completely get that, and I do think flight instructors need to be comfortable in spin situations, because people will just do the craziest thing. But when I do those pre-solo stage checks with students, a number of times I've had them, I'll ask them to do a stall, and they will drop a wing, crank the ailerons the other direction, and instead of relaxing the angle of attack and using the rudder, and provoke a spin.
Yeah.
If the left wing drops and you crank the ailerons to the right at just the right time, even at 152, the airplane will kick off into a spin because of the differential aileron positions. And so if you're going to instruct, I think you do need to be comfortable. That was another argument the FAA made, which I think has some merit, which is that there aren't many instructors anymore who are really competent in spins. And because the examiners don't want to do spins on a CFI check ride. And so CFI candidates go up and climb up to 6,000 feet and pull back on the stick and kick the rudder and go around a few times and manage to recover in a very benign airplane where if you just let go, it will basically recover. And then they get signed off, and that's the sum total of experience. And one of the reasons the FAA argued against continuing spin training as part of the private curriculum is there's just not enough instructors left who understand it, and as well as they should. So that's a whole different issue. What do we do about instructors? But so,
George, have you ever taken a 152 when it starts into a spin like that, and do what Hines was talking about? The guy had mentioned to him, try rolling the rudders. I mean, not the rudders, the ailerons towards the way it broke. I'm just curious if that could that help?
well, I've never intentionally tried that. I have demonstrated lots of times how if you crank the ailerons opposite to the developing spin, it will cause the airplane to spin even more.
Right.
We did that.
Yeah.
I mean, that almost seemed like it would indicate that, well, it might help a little bit, because you are changing the angle of attack when you change the aileron. So what you're doing, you do that, you're making the angle of attack worse on the side that's less stalled. So maybe you tend to start to stall it as much and take you out of the spin, maybe?
Well, let me think about this. If the airplane is starting to spin to the left and I add pro spin ailerons, that would mean the left aileron is going up and the right aileron is going down.
Right. So you're making the angle of attack worse on the right aileron at that point.
Yeah. And that would tend, like I said, the only time I've heard that discussed is as a possible means of breaking a flat spin. I don't know.
My 2 cents is that each aircraft is different. You don't really know. You got to check the particular aircraft.
Yeah, I defer to you guys who understand aerodynamics more than I do.
No, George, you and I are going to have to go check that out now.
I'm game.
That's all there is to it.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Can I be on the ground and photograph it?
Absolutely.
Just get out there underneath the pattern at 500 feet.
Well, as you remember, Hines, we tried, and as you just pointed out, we tried. I don't think there's a lot to be taught to somebody by just taking them up to 6,000 feet and spinning the airplane a few turns and recovering. I really don't think that teaches you much, and that is mostly what passes for spin training these days. And as you remember, Hines, we tried a lot of different things, all sort of focused on awareness of what was happening. Which way the ball goes, that kind of thing, when it speeds up, when it slows down.
What kind of aircraft were you in? The Citabria?
152.
The Citabria is really good for that too, though.
It is, but Dwight will tell you ours only spins one way, the wrong way.
Well, So that seems to be fixed now. In rebuilding it, it now actually, it used to spin more easily to the right than the left, which puzzled the hell out of us. That's just wrong. And we had checked the rigging. We had Tom Malachuk check the rigging. Everything was fine. We never could figure it out. Now I think it does spin a little more easily to the left than the right. I've not explored it a lot. But one thing I know, I'm not a little guy. If I'm solo in that thing and it's got a lot of fuel, I cannot keep it in a spin at idle.
Yeah.
If to keep it in a spin, I have to have it at about 1500 RPM if I'm solo. Or I find a sacrificial person to sit in the back seat. That also works.
Yeah.
But the CG is too far forward if it's just me.
Not enough elevator.
Yeah. But it's an incredibly benign spinning airplane, which makes it a lot of fun.
Do you call them sacrificial because you're kind of one and done with them?
It depends upon the person. I've got people I've flown with who think it's fun. They have no problem being in the back seat. George has been in the back seat a lot with us spinning that thing.
Yeah.
In the front seat too, for that matter. But I had one guy who he really, really, really wanted to spin it or ride along with the spin. And I did one quarter turn incipient entry. So not even remotely fully developed. And that was it. We had to go back to the airport. We were done. He did not actually get sick. He was able to, but he was like, nope, I can't do this. I'm like, that's fine. Yeah. Not a problem. Back we went.
We all have
but
our
depends
days.
on the person.
Well, I really appreciate, I mean, I've learned a lot from listening to you guys. We're not setting policy here. We're not changing the FARs. But if we were setting policy, who would, when we do what I've talked about doing for 30 years, writing a Wings of Carolina flight training syllabus, what would we do about stalls? Who wants to write that policy right here, right now?
Stalls or spins?
Spins, yeah. I think of them. Oh. I think of them as the same. I mean, when Heinz and I went up and did this, sort of to replicate what I like to do with CFIs, we did a lot of stalls. But yes, we're talking about spins, sure.
Well, I'll give you my thoughts on it because I've had quite a number of hours that I thought about it before I ever got into a spin. I mean, I was a 1,000-hour pilot and never done a spin in my life. And my thought was, do I want to really encounter a spin the first time, having never done one without somebody that knows what the hell is happening? To me, it's that initial sensation and know what that's like. It's one thing to talk about it and know what you're supposed to do. It's another to actually have the physical experience and do it, and have the your mind still around it to be able to do it. That was it for me. That's why I would vote that people should experience it. Now, should they have to do it? Maybe not, but I think experiencing it is useful.
I have a thought that it could be a voluntary syllabus. It's an extra, and you could present to the students a option, a choice, and say, here's an extra part of the curriculum. It's not required by the regulations, and if people don't want to do it, they don't have to do it. But if you're interested, you could sign up for these extra number of flights or extra hours with the instructor. If it's canned and it's more thorough, I have the sense that all of us are thinking it should either not be done or it should be done well, with more than just a casual one turn, one example. So possibly introduce an additional syllabus that's an option for the student. That might be one approach.
I think I'm right there with Jim. I don't think it should be mandatory. I do understand the concerns about the distinction between a spin versus a spiral. I do understand the concerns about people feeling maybe more empowered than they should be and deciding to go out and spin. I do think, part of any sort of training would have to include some cautions regarding that. But I do think it should be optional, as I've said before with people. For those who are really interested, yeah, go seek it out. I think it's a great thing. I think it really does inform you more about the edges of the aircraft's performance, and I think knowledge is good, but I don't think everyone is suited for it. I don't think it should be mandatory.
Heinz, what do you think?
I kind of would just like to continue on with Dwight's thought. Certainly not mandatory. It's not required by the FAA, nor should we require it for lots of good reasons. I think it's something that needs to be done. One, we need to have some assurance that the instructors that are teaching this know what they're doing. So, and I think we all know that typically what you get with your CFI training doesn't necessarily do enough adequate spin training to do that. So some kind of club certification, that's probably the wrong term, but club training from you, George, or appropriately qualified pilots to make sure the instructors know what they're doing and know how they're teaching it. And then the thing that I like about spins, if you have the appetite for it, and most of my primary students don't. When we talk about it, they don't want to even go near a stall, let alone a spin. But if you got the appetite for it, it's a lot of fun. And so, yeah, it teaches people things about aerodynamics. If you've got a competent instructor, I think it's manageable in the right airplanes and safe, and it's fun. So what the heck?
So let me jump back in real quick. We talk about all these pragmatic reasons to learn these skills, to have these experiences. I want to piggyback off what Heinz said. Another thing that I've always thought is it is just fun. And doing something for the experience itself, to learn a little bit more, but also to just have fun, I don't think that that's an invalid reason either. So thank you, Heinz. You reminded me of a point that I think is actually important.
I agree with Heinz and what you were just saying there, but let's qualify that little bit. If the student finds out some portion into the training that it's not fun, that it's scary every time, and is getting sick and so forth, then you cut it for sure.
Yeah.
And then that brings me back to the point that I was going to make, is the difference between stalls and spins, obviously. And my feeling is that they should not have a choice, as I think I said before, to not experience what I call a wing drop, just a quick 90-degree, and then you're out, and train to get on the rudder and relax the back pressure. Because if they have that, and if that's what's starting, seems to me that would be a natural thing for them to do, and that will probably bite it, right there. You won't have a full-blown spin. But I think that actually doing spins and multiple turn spins, you really have to know who you got. And you would lose me, for instance, because I did that because I wanted to be a CFI, and I did it, and and enough that I felt safe doing it, but I disliked it every time.
Yeah, and I've had some students that have the appetite. I haven't done this with any students, but I've had some students that have the appetite and the ability to do that kind of training, and lots of them wouldn't even want to go near it. I think it's interesting, John, when you say, make sure they experience a wing drop. Absolutely agree with that 100%. And that just, for me, that happens.
Right.
They will screw that up. The ball will not be centered. That wing, 152, that wing is coming down.
Well, I was going to ask how many students
It's not anything I have to do special to make that happen.
Well, I just was going to ask that question. How many students do you run into that they don't have that happen? Because I know when I was learning, it sure happened to me a bunch when I was learning.
There are a few students who are fastidious about that, and that I've run into. But my point is that it needs to happen multiple times until it's absolutely relaxed. Just when it happens to you, it's relaxed. You relax the back pressure, hit the rudder, don't even think about it. That's what you want to get in there. And I think that'll solve a lot of the problem. And if you want to call that, spin training, fine, but I don't think it is, but that's another matter.
Well, along that lines, if you have a student who's enthusiastic and wants extra and wants to, pay for more and experience things even beyond spins, well, send them off to Tennessee to that Kirshner course, the one he used to teach it now. There's that lady Cavanaugh that teaches it now, but simple acrobatics, a loop and a roll and some spins, so there's always an option to specialize it and, export it, send it away to somebody
There are
else.
places to go. Yeah.
Would we have, as a flying club, have an issue, as from a insurance perspective, doing something more called spin training at the club? And if that is the case, maybe we could come up with somebody that, like one of the people you just mentioned, that we could say we're going to offer it sort of through the flying club, invite them to come down, and we've got 4 or 5, 6, whatever number of students they could come down and do the more elaborate basic aerobatic training too.
That makes sense.
I doubt that would work.
Check out the insurance. I agree with you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Checking insurance, but for a specialized school like this one in Tennessee, I think they're comfortable just staying where they're at and not traveling.
So I've been debating for a while now, getting a super decathlon and starting to do tailwheel and spin training. So I've looked at the insurance. It's steep, but not too terrible. So it's doable. We'll see. It's unfortunately, when you add up airplane insurance, hangar maintenance, it's a fair bit of money. But
so it's another way not to make much money in aviation.
You can charge more. You can charge more, but it's another good way to not make much money in aviation.
So I gather you don't want to use your little airplane to do that work, huh?
Unfortunately, well, 2 things. Actually, 3 things. For one, it's not legal.
Right.
The only thing you can use experimentals for is type-specific transition training. The second is, honestly, the RV spins too fast. Yeah. I'm not entirely convinced that most students would get a lot out of it. You'd have to work with them a long time for things. It's not that things slow down if you do it more, but you learn the components of what's happening, and it feels slower. You can discern it. I think it would take a lot longer for people to grok what was going on. And the other is, I spent over 12 years of my life building that thing. I'm not going to let folks go manhandle it. So 3 reasons.
You know it's strong then.
I'll spin it. But honestly, I think spinning the Citabria is more fun. Just because, it's the RV is such a almost vicious spinner. I've spun a Pitts, and I swear the RV spins as fast. So, yeah, I don't think it'd be the best spin trainer, truthfully.
No, I was teasing.
Well, people keep asking me.
So
declining.
So for fun, here's an article I found a while back about why don't figure skaters get dizzy when they spin. And this was a Scientific American article. This is not, your typical internet drivel. And it's actually really interesting because he goes, I have to go back to I have to get in there somewhere. But this guy's a neuroscientist, and he talks about how skaters train their eyes, and it gets, I'd have to read it again to really follow it, but he just talks about how the inner ear sensations and the motion of your eyes can either exaggerate and aggravate or ameliorate to some extent the sensations that you get when you spin. And Dwight and I were talking a little bit this afternoon about when we do spins, what do we do with our eyes? And he talks about here, skaters suppress the dizziness by learning how to counteract nystagmus with another type of eye movement called optokinetic nystagmus. And it's how we track a moving object with our eyes, as opposed to the situation that you have if you're in an airplane where you're moving and the objects are not, they're on the ground. And I can't wait to go out and do some spins and see if I can train my eyes to reduce the ill effect of the spin. So John, maybe there's hope for you after all. We'll go out and we'll try to work on our optokinetic nystagmus.
Well, George, for too many years, I've been embarrassed by having to tell, CFI students way back, I'm sorry, I have to go back to the airport. It's been an hour and 10 minutes, and I don't want to throw up in the airplane. That's just not left a good taste.
But he also talks about how ballet dancers, as they pirouette, they try very hard to keep the rotation at a constant speed, because we were talking about acceleration earlier. Your inner ear senses acceleration, not motion. So if they can make those pirouettes a constant speed, it's only the starting and the stopping that is disorienting to them. And it talks about how they try to keep their body moving at a fairly constant speed, but fix their gaze on one spot. And Dwight and I were talking about, I mean, that's what I do when I'm doing spins. You try to do it over a landmark if you can, a road or something. Mm-hmm. And I take a snapshot each time around, and try to keep my eyes focused on that spot so I can count the turns. Anyway, and sometimes it talks about how, and I've seen this in ballet dancers, they will, in a pirouette, they will have their eyes on a certain spot, and they'll try to keep, as they make the turn, they'll try to keep their eyes on that spot until they no longer can, because the degree of rotation of their body exceeds how much they can rotate their eyes. So they try not to move their head. They will, as they rotate, they will just, it's really hard for me, but they will keep their eyes on that spot until they no longer can, because they've rotated, your eyes will only rotate less than 90 degrees. And then they whip their head around to that spot again. And I've seen dancers do that, and I've always wondered why. I've also wondered why they didn't break their neck, but so I think the secret may be here. This can be part of our spin training curriculum. Anybody that wants to see this article, I'll send you the link. But,
so go take ballet training before you come to spin training. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a lovely dress too. You might want.
We can have people practicing their pirouetting out in the hangar.
Exactly.
It would be fascinating.
Well, before you can spin the airplane, we have nystagmus training out in the hangar. I think this could be a thing. Anyway.
I'm thinking of our YouTube channel, George.
Oh yeah. Well, we need to find a really good ballet dancer to come in and demonstrate that. I mean, that would be a sensation.
That would be a sensation.
Unfortunately, all the dancers I know are my age now, and their bodies are broken down, their knees are shot, their backs in constant pain. So if there's anything that's worse than spinning an airplane, it's dancing. Anyway, this has been really helpful, and Dwight and I actually kind of had a misunderstanding, I think we can safely call it, when I wrote that article for the club newsletter. And it seemed, I think, that I was saying that spin training is a bad thing, and Dwight wants to do spin training with people, as do I. I wasn't saying that at all. I was just saying that the FAA has some legitimate points, that spin training in and of itself, and particularly the way it's too often done, I don't think has a prophylactic benefit in reducing accidents, because I think they're right. The kinds of ways in which people are having fatal accidents. Over about the last 30 years, the stats I saw, they depend on how you read it, but they seem to suggest that about 10% of accidents were stall spin accidents. And of course, about 13 to 15% of the fatal accidents were stall spin accidents because they tend to be of that nature. And the way spin training is often done, I think the FAA is right about that. And I think that not that many instructors anymore are really qualified to do spin training both safely and in a way that's productive. And I was just saying to club members, just going out and making the airplane go round and around a couple of times, it's not going to teach you much. Your instructor is not going to have much idea what's going on most of the time. And as Jim said, every airplane's different, and it's different on Wednesday than it is on Monday. And you need to be doing this with somebody who has a lot of experience in that airplane. None of us will be Bill Kirshner and know that in the 14th turn it goes a little flat. But it's a serious business, and it should be taken seriously. And I think Jim explained it pretty well, and everybody else added on some important thoughts. And that's really all I was trying to say, that if we're going to do this, we should be disciplined about it. We should have the right people doing it. We should make sure that students don't go out and drop a wing and then come back and tell everybody hanging around in the club, we did spins today. Why didn't your instructor do spins? That's not healthy for anybody, because then you're going to have instructors being pressured to teach spins to people who don't enjoy them, don't understand them, are not really competent to do them. And that's really all I was trying to say. And Dwight and I worked out our misunderstanding. They should all have the opportunity to fly with Dwight.
Let me add one thing, because I do the ground schools. I am aware that the theory of recovering from spins, the FAA does want you to talk about. And so I do that in the ground school, and I assume all the instructors are doing that as well and logging it. But I think that if I do it once and then the instructors do it the second time, that it might even stick a little bit. But I go through that for what it's worth. So just let you know, for those of you who are instructors.
Yeah, the pair recovery is what this seems to be what we're supposed to be teaching now.
That depends on aircraft.
Yep.
Sure.
But I think so yeah, don't worry, John. Yes, we teach that to all of our students.
Absolutely.
I think per club procedures, we teach that for all of our annual flight reviews, et cetera, et cetera. So it's reinforced, and hopefully they won't have to use it if they just don't stall.
Right.
Yeah, and for the record, here you have it. Power to idle, ailerons neutral, rudder opposite the spin, and elevator forward if necessary. Reduce the angle of attack.
Unless you're in a Champ or an ASW-20 sailplane, and a number of other different things.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, there's different orders in certain airplanes.
This is why
what I've seen is the differences in the airplanes that I've flown. Some minor differences in terms of what you do with the elevators. I found too, George, when we went out and played around the 152s, the elevator briskly full forward really wasn't a good thing in the 152s, because it went really into a fast spiral dive and the red line coming up close. And it seemed to be much more gentle if you just kind of went neutral and relaxed it.
You're exactly right. I mean, the 152 has such benign characteristics in that way, and that's the problem. What I've seen time and time again is that the average pilot will just inadvertently relax the back pressure. I mean, to keep a 152 in a spin, you have to hold it hard against the stops with full aft elevator. I mean, hold it against the stops. You relax almost an imperceptible amount, and it starts flying again. And unfortunately, you're still going around and around, you're still looking down at the dirt, and unless you are sensitive to what's happening,
And I'd like to go back to Jim's point that he's made several times about every airplane is different. It's one thing if you're trying to teach spins in Skyhawk, of all things, for instance, which many flight schools use, which is really benign, in my opinion. And then they, X years later, and haven't thought about it, they bought themselves a, say a 300 horsepower Mooney, and the spin characteristics are going to be totally different.
Totally.
Yeah, and it's like night and day.
Well,
Jim,
folks,
any-
this has been very interesting. I'm going to, wrap it up for myself and say I really appreciate being invited to participate. Nice to see you all. But
Well,
Glad
it's
you could join us, Jim.
very helpful to me. And Ken and Jim, I hope we will be flying again soon.
So-
I'm not gonna kid anybody. I don't think it will be really soon, but that's a whole nother conversation. But when we do, I really look forward to having both of you instruct with us. I think it's going to be really exciting, and I'm really looking forward to that.
well, good night, everybody.
Good
Okay.
night.
See
Yeah,
ya.
I'm gonna sign off too.
Yeah, me too. Good night.
Night.
Night all.
Thanks, Heinz.
See you, Heinz. So we need to go spin again soon, George. We got things to try.
We do. We do. And some different airplanes. The Citabria. I don't need to go spin the RV. I'll take your word for it.
Oh, you really should ride along with one at least.
I will. Sure.
It recovers just fine.
Sure.
It's just after that, literally after the first quarter, you get a really sudden acceleration.
Hmm.
It's fast enough, and I've done it enough, but it still startles me a little bit.
Yeah. I
Uh,
wonder why.
yeah,
Just a slick airplane, but
it's a slick airplane. I think at that point it's gotten nose down enough
yeah.
that it starts to pick up speed. And with those stubby little wings, it can accelerate the spin quickly.
It's a clipped wing RV.
It all RVs are clip wing airplanes.
I know. I know. But how you think of all of the experimental airplanes that people have dreamed up.
Yeah.
And I often say what you will, Beechcraft got it right when they built the Bonanza in 1951 or whenever the first one was built. They just nailed it.
Yep.
And everybody has their favorite Bonanza, but it is just they just nailed it. And Vans just nailed a design that it's a great cruising airplane. It will do aerobatics, and I know they're different, RVs and so on.
Oh, sure.
Some biased one way or the other. They don't come apart, assuming they're built properly.
Yep.
They are incredibly rugged. It's not for nothing that there are so many of them out there.
Yeah, it's true.
How many of them are out there flying?
I've not looked at the latest number.
Well,
I know there's over 10,000.
That's unbelievable.
Yep. Let me see. They normally keep that number up on their website.
Of course, not everybody
They're pretty proud of it.
should be.
10,687 right now, flying. And now that's across all the models from the 3 to the 10.
Sure.
But yeah.
Well, it's got to make them the second or third most populous general aviation airplane ever.
Yeah. If I have any complaints about the RV, it's that it's a very and I think because of the short wing, it's a very stiff ride. It is. It flies like a little sports car, but it also rides like a little sports car.
Yeah.
And in turbulence, you're going to get the crap beat out of you.
It's a rough ride.
It's a very rough ride.
Yeah.
I don't have any problem with that personally, except when I hit my head on the canopy, but which happens. But other than that, it's such a delightful plane to fly. But I do think it would be a terrible plane to try and do spin training with people in, or even tail wheel training in.
Yeah.
Not the right choice.
Yeah. And it's not a, if you're trying to travel and fly IFR in it, there's nowhere to put stuff, and you don't even have a panel to put things up on.
Yeah.
So, they're compromises, but.
And do you remember the IPC we did in the RV where you had me close my eyes?
Oh, yeah.
And I normally play that game pretty well.
Yeah.
And, we were starting to get pointed at the ground in seconds. And you were, I think, a little surprised. So we went up and you had me do it again.
Yeah.
The third time you told me, okay, this time recover. Well, we always recovered fine. He said, but this time when you recover, open don't recover just on the panel, look outside.
Right.
And I knew what I was going to see. We were going to see trees.
Right.
But on that one, I glanced over the VA before we did the recovery. And you may not remember, but we were doing 7,000 feet per minute down. And we were not at V&E.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
so I guess the other complaint I'd have is without an autopilot is a crappy instrument platform.
Yeah.
It's just a terrible instrument platform.
Yeah. Yeah. Not.
It's not made for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. That's true. It's an awesome airplane in so many ways. But yeah, we got a few more things on the agenda. Between the Citabria, the Cub, and
Yep.
someday the 172s again, 152s.
Well, the 172s are so hard to spin.
Yeah.
I would honestly like to spin them a little more. I don't think I've done more than a turn in the 172s.
Yeah.
I would be fascinated to let them develop a little bit more and see if they settled into more of a spin. But, on the same token, I want to roll one, but that's a whole different discussion.
All right. I'm stopping the recording right here. All right, we are, let's see.